Today I'm going to read through my manuscript for the first time ever. I've just missed this world so much. I've missed these characters and it feels really good to be back. Today, I did a thing. How many outlines does one writer need? And the answer is always more outlines. The long and short of it is, I feel like I've spent the last 3 or 4 weeks just staring my manuscript in the face, frowning at it, and trying to figure out what I didn't like very much and how I plan to change it. In a way, I feel like I kind of figured out the last puzzle piece of this book, and when I put it in, everything just clicked into place. Alright friends, today's the day! I finally pulled out my manuscript from the archive drawer that it's been sitting in for the last 6 weeks or so. Originally I was going to give myself a month, I ended up giving myself 6 weeks. And the goal behind that was just so that I would have enough emotional and mental distance from the book so that by the time I did read through it again, it would feel like reading it for the first time. I also brought a little legal pad so that I can scribble down any notes or questions that come to mind as I read through it. So it's time to start marking up this book. I just got back from the coffee shop, changed into some comfy clothes. Today I read the first third of Project Amaranth, roughly. About that much. Honestly, I've been dying to read this book since the minute that I put it in the drawer. It's been like 6 weeks of just agony waiting to crack this manuscript open again. I've just missed this world so much. I've missed these characters and it feels really good to be back. There were actually kind of a lot of things that caught me off guard reading through it this time. I feel like the biggest takeaway is how, like, the first chapters definitely need some work. I can see how I have grown as a writer through the novel, and so the first few chapters feel very reminiscent of how I would write about 3 years ago. It's cool because I can see me discovering my own voice throughout the novel, which is really cool, but it does mean that I want to do a lot of work to those early chapters. I've spent the last few weeks plotting out the sequel, so to come back to this and remember just how strong the vibes are in this first book and how much, like, you're really there. The whole world of the story feels so real to me, and it's really cool to see how the prose or like the writing itself manages to kind of transport you into this place that I've imagined about for so long. So those are kind of some reflections from day 1 of reading. Anyway, so I'm excited to keep reading and I will catch you all tomorrow. Okay, I have officially finished my entire read-through of the whole manuscript. Yay! So now that I have read through the entire manuscript and I've ensured that there's nothing absolutely humiliating in this draft, I have formatted the manuscript, prepared it for print. I made the font size a little smaller and reformatted it so that instead of like being 500 pages, it would be 355 pages to print. Just trying to save the trees, you know? Somewhat trying to save the trees. But there is something to the physical reading experience, and I don't want to just send this to people digitally because it doesn't have the same effect, you know? When you're actually reading a physical book. You know what I'm saying. You know what I'm saying. I'm quite satisfied with the way that it looks now, and so I'm going to go print this 355-page monstrosity. Like I said, there are very few people I'm willing to let read this manuscript right now. It's really just 2 people that I'm gonna pass this along to for a very, very early alpha reader level thoughts, which feels even weird because knowing what I know, having read through the book at this point, there's so much about it I want to change. So it does feel a little weird to give it to somebody asking for their feedback when I already know what I need to work on. I mean, I'm sure there's more feedback that I could get from these people, but I feel like there are very large level issues with this manuscript that I want to be changing in the next draft, and so it feels a little bit strange to kind of hand it out early and ask for people's opinions and thoughts when it's not complete, you know? It kind of bothers me, but I shouldn't let it bother me. It's really not that big of a deal. Anyway, let's go print this book. I did a thing. So over the weekend, I finished rereading my manuscript. What I worked on today was I kind of skimming through the whole manuscript from beginning to end. I ended up outlining the whole book. Basically, I created 2 plot grids, one for each of the main plots of the book. It was surprisingly fun to do, and it really felt like I was able to kind of zoom out and get a bird's eye view of the narrative as a whole. Because when I was reading it, I was finding myself really caught up in the emotional aspect of the book, but this allows me to kind of get back into sort of a structural overview of the story and how things progress from one beat to the next. It's kind of easier to see where the promises I made at the beginning of the book are not really fulfilled by the end, or in contrast, where things that are resolved at the end aren't necessarily foreshadowed or promised in the way that I want them to be at the beginning. I feel like now that I've got a really good grasp of the outline, and now that that's almost finished up, basically I just want to create a massive list of everything that I think needs work in this next draft. So if you recognize my surroundings, you might know this from a former video, but I am back in San Jose. I'm back on the Bay. My husband had another business trip, so I'm turning it into something of a writing retreat. I'm up here for the next 2 or 3 days, and I am trying to figure out what the heck I'm doing when it comes to Project Amaranth. My hope while I'm up here is that I'm going to be able to figure out something of a plan of action when it comes to how I plan to tackle this next draft. A few days ago, I was in a bookstore and I found this book on the writing life by Annie Dillard, and there was a part in here that just really struck me. So this is what she says. The latest version of a literary work begins somewhere in the work's middle and hardens towards the end. The earlier version remains lumpishly on the left. The work's beginning greets the reader with the wrong hand. In those early pages and chapters, anyone may find bold leaps to nowhere, read the brave beginnings of dropped themes, hear a tone since abandoned, discover blind alleys, track red herrings, and laboriously learn a setting now false. I really learned how to write with this book, and I can tell, reading back through it, where I was influenced by certain books I was reading, where I was trying to figure out new styles and new themes and stuff. And about halfway through the novel, it really kind of hits its own stride and kind of comes into its own. But at least as of right now, I feel like the first half of the novel, maybe the first third of the novel, doesn't quite feel like the rest of it does. So I really feel like part of this revision process is going to involve going back to those early chapters and just rewriting them from scratch. I heard someone say that you should rewrite the beginning chapters in the voice of all that's happened. Basically just meaning that when you are first writing those early chapters, you don't necessarily know all that the story's going to encompass, but by the time you write the entire draft through and return to those early chapters, you can kind of carry the weight of all that's going to happen and infuse that into those early pages. So that was kind of the first thing that I noticed that needed a lot of work. Another thing is a little bit more abstract, but basically like the backdrop of the entire novel changes significantly from beginning to end. Kind of the situational context in the background changes from the first half of the book to the second half of the book. So I just need to go through and make that cohesive across the board, and that involves working through some things that I hadn't really wanted to work through in the first draft. So I just need to kind of discover what exactly is going on in that backdrop and how to make it cohesive across the board. And then lastly, I think I told you how I went in last week and wrote out a very detailed outline here for the entire novel. So what I want to do for this is just kind of, having stripped the novel down to just the bare bones here, I want to kind of see how it aligns with the 4-act structure and with the hero's journey, and just kind of see if the beats are falling in the right places. You know, I just kind of want to get a bird's eye view of the pacing and, you know, moments of the story and how everything's building on itself to reach the conclusion. I've been constantly referring back to this book. This is Refused to be Done by Matt Bell, and it's a very, very clear step-by-step outline of how to go about writing and rewriting your book until it's done. But one of the things he really talks about is how if you have multiple plot threads in your novel, for example, I have a kind of a past plot and a present plot, and they kind of intertwine, you need to separate them, and then you want to work on both of them in terms of structure, pacing, plot, before you go back and intertwine them in editing. So what I had done last week is I made those outlines for both plots, and I just want to go through and kind of see how they line up in terms of the hero's journey, in terms of the 4-act structure. Once I feel like the pacing is good, once the outline kind of reflects the new version of the book that I want to write, then I'll go in and probably rewrite the entire draft from start to finish. There's something in the act of rewriting every single word that I feel like is really going to help bring the story, kind of that cohesiveness that I'm looking for. Anyway, I really don't know if any of that made sense right now, but these are just my very free-flowing, unfiltered thoughts on how I'm going to go about doing this editing process. I hope it made sense. So I've already packed up my bag with my manuscript and all the other tools that I'll need for today, and this morning I went out and grabbed myself an acai bowl and a chai, which are two of my favorite things about being here in San Jose. And I'm gonna head up to the rooftop because I feel like that's where last time I was here I was able to really focus and get some work done up there. That's where I'm headed, so let's get to it. Look at this. Look at this glorious, chaotic mess of productivity. I'm back. Today, what I was doing was kind of aligning my novel with the hero, kind of the traditional hero's journey story structure, and seeing the ways that it does and doesn't kind of match with that, and ways that I might want to consider changing certain parts of the story for pacing reasons. All in all, it was a very strangely productive day in that it was a lot of outlining and a lot of kind of verbalizing, writing ideas out for myself that I hadn't really thought about before. I feel like I've been able to kind of verbalize some things about the characters that I maybe hadn't articulated before. So like the characters' core wants and needs, I created these kind of wheels where it sort of follows the hero's journey, just kind of showing the ways that the characters grow and change and like certain pinch points in the story. It's really nice to be able to see it on one page because these are things that I wasn't, like, as I'm writing the novel, I wasn't necessarily thinking to myself, oh, this is what this character's after, or this is the lie the character is believing at the beginning. Those are things that just kind of started emerging in the story as I wrote it, and I was just there to discover it. And now what I'm trying to do is kind of pull all that out and really refine it for myself so that I understand on a very broad level what these characters are motivated by, what they're pursuing, what their goals are, what kind of propels them into the story, you know, all those kind of big picture questions, I guess. And another one of the really big epiphanies that I got from today's work was that one specific character, their arc is never fully resolved in the way that I want it to be, at least not on the page. So I'm realizing that because of some of the point of view switches and such, this character doesn't quite get the resolution that they need to get in their arc, which is kind of a big deal. I wouldn't have maybe necessarily known that unless I did this sort of outlining process, and now I feel like I just feel like I have a much better understanding of what that character needs. So anyway, all this to say, this is taking a very different turn than I was expecting it to be, but it's just kind of fun. Like, again, guys, I'm learning all of this with you. I have no idea what I'm doing. This is the first time I've ever really done this with a novel, so I am just learning, and we're gonna figure this out together. Anyway, I guess I will catch all of you tomorrow. I've obtained some very crucial supplies for our journey today. I went down the street and there's a stationery shop, and they packed it up in a crinkly paper bag. One of my favorite sounds. So I got a couple different things. So first of all, I got some clips for the manuscript, some highlighters for the outline and the manuscript, I suppose. I got a couple more pens because I'm always losing mine. And then I also picked up a spiral notebook. And this one was chosen with great care because this is what I envision to be my new story planning notebook. So like all of the outlines, all of the kind of macro scale story stuff is all gonna go in this one. So I wanted to pick a big one because I like being able to like flip it open and have lots of paper to work with when I'm doing outlines. But also yesterday when I was doing all those little maps and kind of outlines of the story, I was realizing I want these all in one place. Like, I don't want just a bunch of loose papers. So I feel like this is just a first principle of writing, if possible, is so much of writing is all in your head that anything you can do to get it out on paper, to mark it up with colors, and to use your hands creating something, I feel like that just helps you, I don't know, it just helps get the creative juices flowing. It definitely makes me happy. I got my office supplies, I got my chai, so let's get to work. Most of my time up at the writing retreat was spent on kind of creating more of a large scale, kind of broad overview of the plot as it stands right now. Now that I'm back home, what I've started working on is crafting a very detailed chapter-by-chapter outline of the entire novel. Essentially what I'm doing is I have the manuscript open in one tab and the chapter outline in another, and as I kind of scroll through the manuscript, I'm just taking note of every time a new character, setting, world-building aspect is introduced, any instances of foreshadowing or any secrets or spells that are alluded to. I'm just making note of all of that, tracking things like flashbacks, the chronology of events, anything related to story structure or character motives, all of those things. I'm just trying to compile in one massive document that's kind of like a smaller scale version of the manuscript. And as I work through this outline, I'm also trying to make note of any questions that I have as I go through the manuscript, any inconsistencies or questions that need to be answered in this next draft. So I have a lot of feedback for these early chapters, and so I want to kind of comb through that feedback and separate out all the questions to their corresponding chapters, or like where that question needs to be answered in the book. I'm just consolidating it all down into this outline so that I can kind of work with this outline and start shaping it into the kind of the better book that I want to write. The whole concept of this chapter outline comes from Refused to be Done by Matt Bell. This is a wonderful little book, and I've been referencing it frequently. It's kind of my lantern as I walk through the murky roads of revision. This is what Matt Bell writes about creating this outline. In this document, the goal is to try to capture the main story of the novel, by which I mean the action of the book's prime timeline. What you want to get down in this outline are the book's events, a term Anna Kesey usefully defines as everything that progresses time in the narrative. In other words, not interiority, not digression, not backstory, just what happens. As you write your outline, study the cause and effect relationship between events, the beats in the story where time progresses and where action unfolds. By doing this, you'll likely discover which actions and choices drove the plot of the first draft, which are easier to see once divorced from exposition and interiority and backstory. Take your time with this document. Your job here is to make a model of your novel as it exists right now. For the next step in the process to work well, you want this model to be as accurate as possible. So I've been at this all morning, and I've just reached chapter 8, so I'm not very far into it yet, but chapter 8 of 45, I think? How many chapters do I have? I don't even know. Anyway, so I hope that little peek into the process is helpful, and I'm going to jump back into it. Okay. Hi. So, at the risk of sounding a little overdramatic, I think I've just solved everything. If you look at the whiteboard behind me, you will see a cluttered up, glorious mess of thoughts and untanglings. The long and short of it is, there was this particularly tricky thing that honestly has been bothering me since the beginning of the year. Just this kind of like the background, I guess, situational conflict that the whole story is kind of dependent upon. I just couldn't quite crack it. Nothing I was doing felt totally right. Like there have been several iterations of what it could look like, and none of them really clicked. None of them felt exactly right. But yesterday my friend said something on a call, and it just triggered this new idea, this new thought. I've just been mulling it over all day. So I talked it all through with my sister tonight, and we just kind of brainstormed out the different ways that it could kind of fit into the story and what it could look like. And I think it fits perfectly. It's actually pretty incredible. I'm really excited to write it now. I feel like finally, I have a clear draft vision, you know? Bless my sister. This story wouldn't exist without her. I'm just gonna spend all day planning out exactly what this is gonna look like in the book and all the possible implications and all the juicy new scenes that I get to write, and I'm just very, very excited about it all. So anyway. It's surprisingly difficult trying to summarize a 150,000 word manuscript in outline form. Today I finally finished that big outline that I've been working on the last few weeks. Basically, the idea is I'm hoping to work on that outline until it somewhat resembles the better version of the book that I want to write for this next draft. Last night, my sister came over and we were able to talk through one of the trickiest parts of the entire story that I've had up until this point. I've had this idea floating around in my mind for a few days now, but it was really fun to kind of tease it out and basically just see the implications of what this would look like if it were going on in the background of the story. But I was able to figure out how all of these key scenes align with kind of this different context for the whole book. So I'm kind of having a hard time putting it into words, but basically it just feels like this idea that I came up with really just kind of solves a lot of the problems that I had with the book, and it just adds a lot more depth, a lot more potential for future books, and it just, in a way, I feel like I kind of figured out the last puzzle piece of this book, and when I put it in, everything just clicked into place, you know? I really love that feeling as a writer when you have been struggling with something, and then when you finally do stumble on the solution, it makes everything you've already written make a lot more sense. A lot of the inconsistencies that I had in the manuscript in this past draft are solved by this new idea. So basically it's just all gonna make a lot more sense, which I'm very excited for. Anyway, so that is now my next step of the revision process, is just making a giant plan for what this next draft is gonna look like. I hope you'll excuse my voice today. I'm just recovering from a cold, which is, you can hear it, you know, in my voice. So if at any point you were watching this video and thinking, what has this woman been doing this whole video? We've watched her scramble around and make all these different maps and plot outlines and stuff. I just feel like this has been a very long and rambling video, and even me during the editing process was like, girl, what are you doing? This is not gonna be helpful for people. So in an effort to make this more helpful for you, I thought I would show you what exactly I was doing during all of those mapping and notes and stuff, just to kind of show you the broad scale, like what plot outlines did I find helpful, which ones were a waste of time, that kind of thing. So step one in this entire process was I read through my entire manuscript, which I didn't get down for you, but I can do that right now. Ugh. And while I was reading through it, I kept this little legal pad next. This is not the legal pad, this is the pages of the legal pad that I actually used. Snap out of it, Buzz! I was also marking down anytime I ran into a question or kind of a plot hole or something I was kind of confused by that needs to be resolved in this next draft. So that was step one. Oh, you could really hurt somebody with this. So after rereading Project Amaranth, the very first outlining tactic that I used was called a plot grid. So we talked about plot grids a little bit in my last video, so I'll link that here. Basically, a plot grid is the type of outline that J.K. Rowling was known to use for Harry Potter, and I find it really helpful. I'll kind of show you why. So this is the plot grid that I created for Project Amaranth, and basically each of these columns is a plot thread that happens in the book, and then each of these rows is a chapter in the story. So I'm just detailing what happens in each of these plot threads in each of the chapters and how they're resolved. And what I feel like this plot grid did for me was helping me kind of strip the story down to its bare bones and just let me ask, what is the story about? How does it begin? How does it progress? How does it end? So this next step that I did might have been my favorite part in the entire process, and it was basically just mapping out the character arcs for each of the two main characters. Basically, it just starts out with the hero's journey and just follows the 12 stages of the hero's journey all the way around in a clock form. I also kind of wrote down some details on the side about just kind of the core beliefs that are driving the character, their motivations and fears. Very rarely while writing this book was I thinking about what was driving a certain character or why they were making the choices they were making. It was just very intuitive and very organic, and I was just kind of following what the characters were doing. But now that I'm going into the editing process, I really want to draw these things out for myself so that I have a very strong understanding as I go into revision of what is driving these characters, what they're after. Not so that I can bludgeon the readers with this knowledge, but just to kind of clear it up for me. The more of this I do, the richer the story will feel for others. Okay, so first was the plot grid, second was the character arcs, and third and finally was the very, very long and detailed chapter by chapter outline of the book. I just made it just goes on. Oh, do we reach the end? Okay, so I'll kind of highlight, this is just one chapter highlighted, so I can kind of show you. Basically, in bold, I would just write out the chapter number and the chapter title, and then I would just have a bulleted list of every single thing that happens in that chapter, in each scene, And then kind of drawing from my list of questions and critiques from reading the manuscript, I wrote in just any massive things that needed to be fixed. Ultimately, I think what was most helpful about this was that it allowed me to kind of tweak and change the manuscript in a small scale before I go into rewriting the manuscript on a large scale. So plot grid, character arcs, chapter outline. Do you need this many outlines to edit your book? Probably not, but this is just what it took for me to feel like I understood my story inside and out. Just like 3 long weeks of staring my manuscript in the face at all the ugly bits and like frowning at it and trying to figure out what I didn't like very much and how I plan to change it. But I feel like all that stewing really got me somewhere, and now I feel like I'm at a point where I have a clear plan of what I want my next draft to look like as I go into editing it, just in time for autumn. Anyway, I hope some of that was helpful for you guys. It was definitely an adventure for me, that's for sure. And one more thing I almost forgot is, if you guys have any video requests, please drop those in the comments. I would really love to hear those from you. I've been trying to scheme ahead some content for fall and winter, and it would just be very helpful for me to know what you guys want to see more of or, you know, hear more about on this channel. That would be very cool. So please give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and make sure to subscribe to my channel if you want to catch my next few videos as I go into editing Project Amaranth from beginning to end. And without any further ado, I'll catch all of you guys in my next video. Bye.